Hi guys, Mimi G here, and today we're going to be doing a quick and easy sew along. We're going to be working on Mccall 7833. Let's get started. All right guys, so this is a super simple project. This is Mccall 7833. I'm going to do view C. I like the angled hem. On the back of the envelope, you always have a list of fabrics that are suggested, and then also any notions that you're going to need. So in this case, you're going to need 3/8 of an inch ribbon for the drawstring. You could also do, if you were doing view D, use elastic. And you could actually use elastic for any of these, really. But I think I like the drawstring, so I went ahead and bought the ribbon. We also have very few pieces, so I'm just going to go really quickly through the pieces you need. Pattern piece number 2 is our neck facing. You're going to cut 2 of these, and you're also going to cut 2 of interfacing. I'm doing the sleeve option versus the sleeveless, so I'm going to be cutting out pattern piece number 3, which is our sleeve. You're going to cut 2. And then you're going to cut out pattern piece number 1, which is the front and the back of the dress. So you're going to cut 2 of these. And make sure, one thing I want to point out is the pattern shape is very, very odd because we're in essence gathering one side of the dress, so you'll notice that it has sort of a weird shape. What you want to do is to make sure that you are following your grain line. So when you place this pattern piece on your fabric, make sure that your grain line is parallel to the selvage edge of your fabric. Okay, I don't want you to lay it like this, thinking that this center front line is your grain line. You want to make sure that your grain line down here is straight and parallel to the selvage of your fabric. So I have cut 2 pieces of ribbon that are about 45 inches long, each of them, and it measures about 3/8 of an inch wide. I also have already cut my neck facings, and I went ahead and interfaced them. I have my sleeves cut and both my front and the back. Now that everything's cut and interfaced, we can start sewing. All right, we're going to start with our front and back. So obviously right sides are facing. We're going to go ahead and pin and stitch at our shoulders. And like I said, this is a really easy dress to sew. I think the only time-consuming part might be the gathering, but other than that, it should sew up rather quickly. So I want you to pin your shoulders and go ahead and stitch across using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and serge your seam allowance. Okay, next we're going to sew our right side seam. So that's the side seam that's the longest. If you're doing view C like I am, we have an angled hem. So the longest side, that's the right side. So go ahead and pin the entire side seam. Make sure your notches match up. Okay, now we're going to go ahead to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch our side seam using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, we're stitching using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we're going to sew our side seam, again using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance for our right seam. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Okay, so I went ahead and serged my seams on my side seam and also at my shoulder. Now you'll notice that I went ahead and serged my hemline as well, and I individually sewed each side of my left. So usually I will sew my front to backs or whatever I'm sewing together and then serge my seam together unless I need to press my seam flat. So on the other side, we're using the seam allowance to create a casing for our ribbon, so we can't serge them together. So I like to do it before I even sew, whenever I'm going to either press my seams flat or in this case use them as a casing. I went ahead and serged each individual side seam first. So you are free to do that now. I just think it's easier. Once you create the casing and stitch it, you can no longer get to your seam allowance in a comfortable way anyway. So it's always a good idea to do it beforehand. All right, so now before we get to this side seam, we're going to go ahead and finish off the hem. You have 2 options here. You can do a narrow double fold, so you're going to fold and then fold again. Or you can serge like I have, turn over, and then stitch close to the edge. So that's up to you. We do have an angle here, so it could be a little challenging for some. So if you get to the corner and it's too sharp, try and round it out just a little bit like I did. I find that it's easier, especially if I'm doing a double fold. In this case, I'm going to just use my serge edge and then turn it over. I'm not going to be doing a double fold. The other reason I'm not doing a double fold is because I'm using a velvet fabric. It's not super heavy, but it does have some weight, and I don't want to add too much thickness, and if I do a double fold, I'll be doing that. So it's up to you. It's a personal preference. I'm going to go ahead and press my seam all the way around and then head to the sewing machine and stitch. Okay, so I went ahead and pressed my hem allowance. I do that specifically so that I can stitch on the right side of my fabric. I always like for my bobbin thread to be on the bottom wrong side of my fabric. So having it pressed lets me stitch from the top. Okay, so I'm getting to that little point, so I went ahead and put 2 pins in just to keep that corner in place. Okay, once your hem is done, we can go ahead and start sewing the other side seam. So what you're gonna do is you should have marked a large dot that was just below those double notches that you should also have marked. So I pinned there so that I remember to, that's where I'm gonna start my drawstring. So I'm gonna pin again at the top and then pin all the way down the bottom, or down the side, I should say, of your dress. Okay, now just the same way that we did the other side seam, you're going to go to your machine and you're going to stitch your entire side seam. Only difference here is you're using 3/4 of an inch seam allowance from the bottom of your dress all the way up to under your arm. All right, guys, so I went ahead and pressed my seams open, and now we're going to stitch 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. Starting at the bottom, you're going to work your way all the way up, and you're going to stop at that dot, okay? I put a pin just to remind myself that that's where I'm going to stop my casing. Now, you're going to place this under your sewing machine, and you're going to stitch, making sure you don't catch the underside. Okay, I'm working 1/4 inch away from the raw edge. I'm making sure that I'm only working on this layer, okay? I'm not catching the other side of the dress. And you're just going to go slow, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Just keep moving the rest of the dress out of the way as you move your way up. Continue until you reach your pin and then work your way down the other side. Okay, so I have my both sides done for my casing, and now I put a safety pin at the end of one of my ribbons, and I'm just going to go up one side, and then we're going to tack it at the top and then do the other side. Just work your way up. And right over my dot, I'm just going to go ahead and pull it out. And I'm going to use a pin so that I don't lose it. I'm going to pin through all of it. And then just go to your sewing machine and just tack across so that you can keep your ribbon from moving, right? You're tacking your ribbon down to your dress. You're going to do the same thing on the other side of the casing. Okay, as you can see, I went ahead and tacked my ribbon down, and then all you have to do is pull the ribbons at the bottom so you can gather. You can gather as much or as little as you want. And then you can just go ahead and tie off your ribbon. Now, the only thing we have left to do now is to go ahead and set our sleeve in and then finish our neck. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and stitch our sleeves underarms. So go ahead, right sides facing, pin your underarm seam. You're going to go ahead and pin both of your sleeves like this. Then you're going to stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, guys, so turn your sleeve right side out, and I like to pin first, matching my side seam to my underarm seam. Now, normally if you were setting in a sleeve, I would have you ease the sleeve cap to take up all that excess, but because we're working with knit fabric, you can just sort of stretch and pull to fit. Now, I like to go ahead and pin at my notches first. And then I always make a little notch at my shoulder seam. And now I'm just going to go ahead and ease the rest of that sleeve cap in by pulling just a bit. And just do the same thing on the other side. Just pull and ease in any excess. I'm going to make a couple of snippets. All right, now go ahead to your sewing machine. You're just going to stitch around using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to do your other sleeve the same way. All right, once our sleeves are in, the only thing left for us to do is to finish our neckline. So go ahead and grab your neck facings. You're going to go ahead, head to your sewing machine, and you're going to stitch across each end using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I want you to press your seams open. Once you've done that, go ahead and finish off the raw edge by giving it a serge or a zigzag stitch. Okay, so I've gone ahead, pressed my seams open, and I serged all the way around. Now with right sides facing, I'm going to align my shoulder seam to the seam on my facing. And you should also have notches. So you want to match your notches as well. Okay, once it's all pinned, you're going to go ahead and stitch all the way around using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so for most of the dress, I used just a regular straight stitch because unless I have horizontal seam lines, I don't worry about it too much. But because I want my neckline to stretch as I'm wearing, even though the neckline is a wider opening, I am still going to use my lightning bolt. If your machine has a lightning bolt stitch, great. If not, just use a very narrow zigzag stitch. And we're stitching using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and understitch, and then I'm going to trim the seam allowance. I like to do it after. So remember, you're just stitching on your facing, catching your seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and understitch also using my my lightning bolt stitch or your zigzag stitch. Go all the way around, understitching until you reach your starting point. Okay, once you've sewn on your facing, you're gonna wanna go ahead and remove the excess. So I trim my seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch, and then I tack down at the shoulders just through all layers to keep it, laying flat. And then I gave it a good press, and of course, added my label. The only thing you have left to do is to finish the hem of your sleeve, and you are all done. All right, that's all there is to it. I hope you've enjoyed this sew along. Remember to follow me on Instagram @MimiGStyle. Until next time, peace.